It's on. Okay. Thank you. We're back. We're back into our workshop. It's this afternoon session. We'll have 4 papers in this afternoon. So I'll ask you to just take a look at the clock from time to time. Let's see if we can follow the schedule. Our first guest in this afternoon is Pierre-Emmanuel Bachelet from the Institut d'Asie Orientale, the ENS de Lyon. And she will talk to us about Between Trade and Diplomacy, source materially on the history of China, seas virtual networks, 16th, 19th centuries. Okay, Pierre.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Paolo and Miguel, and thank you very much to everyone here to include me in this team and this project, which is really fascinating. I will try to share. Yeah, I think you should see the PowerPoint. I'm sorry, there has been some problem with the display because the font I used in the PowerPoint is not installed on the computer. So I'm sorry, it won't be as nice and beautiful as I planned, but I'm sure the content will be good. So today I would like to introduce you to the kind of primary sources I've been working on. I've been researching since I started my PhD, so 7 years ago. My main focus, my research is cross-cultural relations, transnational relations in the China Seas between the 16th and the 19th century, with a stronger emphasis on the 17th century. This is why I would like to put some context first, even though these are things you may already know. The 17th century is a watershed moment in the history of the China Seas. To be very quick, you have the Chinese part of this history of the China Seas, so the Ming-Qing transition between the 1630s and the 1680s, the maritime empire of the Chang between the 1614 and 1680s, and one of the most important watershed in this 17th century is in 1684, the lifting of the Qing ban on maritime trade, which leads to a wider opening of Chinese commerce and Chinese merchants on the China Seas. So this is a map. This is a map of the Japanese trade, but as you can see, these are the main trade routes of East and Southeast Asia, including Chinese, Japanese ones. This is also the time of the expansion of Japan's foreign relations. The expansion first of Japan's foreign trade, and after that, the reconfiguration of this foreign trade under a set of restrictions, which were known before as the closed country restrictions, but we don't use the term closed country anymore to talk about this topic. This is also the time of what has been coined as an age of commerce by Anthony Reid in Southeast Asia, even though I think that we should talk about an age of commerce in the China Seas in general, in East and Southeast Asia, and not just in Southeast Asia. And this is also the time, you know it, when all the European countries, companies, merchants struggled and compete to win trading monopolies and settle in the China Seas. So in this context, I focus on the circulations of people mostly, also animal objects and ideas, but mostly people. And I try to understand how people belonging to different groups succeeded or not in understanding each other, in reaching agreements. I'm interested in the roles and functions of go-betweens, the porosity of frontiers between groups and communities, etc. This is why I consider both diplomatic relationships and trading intercourse, diplomacy and commerce being strongly connected, especially in East and Southeast Asia. So I have raised these questions in the book I have published this year, which is my PhD thesis, and which dealt with the history of Japan and early modern Vietnam between the late 16th century and the early 18th century. In order to conduct that research, I have used several historiographical traditions, starting with Japanese scholarships on early modern Japan and Southeast Asian relations, whose leader is Iwao Seiichi. I have also included the larger scholarship, both in Japanese and English, which deals with Japan foreign relations in general. And these are the historians who particularly insisted on dropping the term close country when talking about the relations of early modern Japan, using the phrase used at that time of forbidden sea or this kind of things. Since I am deeply interested in cross-cultural relations, I have also been interested in, I have included the works the works by the historians of global interconnection, whether you use the term global history, connected history, global micro-histories, etc. Starting with people working on Asian traders and networks, such as Denis Lombard, Angela Schottenhammer, François Gipouyou as well, and connecting these historiographical traditions with other areas, such as the Mediterranean or the Northern America. My research is then with people and objects that are most of the time hardly visible in the scholarship and the primary sources. That is why I had to put together Japanese, Southeast Asian, Chinese, European sources in order to build a comprehensive picture of these relations. My corpus of sources is therefore a corpus of complementary sources that shed light on various aspects of these relations. For example, the Chinese language sources deal with diplomatic topics, whereas Dutch and missionary materials highlights for example, the Japanese presence in Southeast Asian ports. So unlike the previous speakers, I won't focus on one specific sources, but I will present the main corpus I used during my research. And I will start with the diplomatic sources, that is official letters and documents, which are called in Japanese kokusho. So in the 17th century, around 150 letters were sent between Japan and various foreign actors between Japan and Southeast Asia. Some of these documents are not, strictly speaking, letters, but documents issued by Southeast Asian authorities and brought in Japan by Japanese merchants. If you're interested, I have translated all the documents in French, all the documents that were sent between present-day Vietnam and Japan at that time, in my PhD dissertation, not in the book. And the PhD dissertation is freely available online if you're interested in that. So most of these official letters, official documents are not extant. They were copied in the late 18th or during the 19th century. Sometimes with multiple versions, with slight differences in the use of characters, etc. And they were included in compilation, the most famous compilation being called the Gaiban Susho from the early 19th century. A few other documents were unearthed by the Kyushu National Museum for an exhibition on the relationships between Japan and Vietnam in 2013. And I used this kind of documents as well. So here is one of these original documents, because we have few original documents, as I told you. It was published in a Vietnamese language journal in the 1920s, and it was presented by the Kyushu Museum in the exhibition I just mentioned. So if you take a look at the text in itself, this is very standardized documents with the few introductory, this part, which is the introduction. It refers to Confucian principles and these kind of things. And the end is always something about the, I don't know if there is, no, there is nothing about the presence, but in general, you also have at the end something about the presence, sense between the diplomatic gifts. And what is most interesting here is the middle part of the letter, of course, but is most of the time this middle part, which deals with very concrete topics, is very short. Sometimes there is no middle part, so there is nothing about concrete relationships, concrete trade, or people that are mentioned. In this specific letter, which was sent by Vietnamese lord to the Nagasaki governor, the Japanese governor of Nagasaki, you have a hint at the peculiarities of Japanese trade, which is to allow Japanese merchants to trade in Southeast Asia, but to specific destinations. They were not supposed to go to another destinations, although they actually did. This leads me to another corpus of documents, those of the travel licenses called in Japanese shinjo. Shinjo is red seal documents, that is the documents issued by the shogunate to allow merchants to trade overseas. We only have, again, a few extant licenses, around 10, but we also have two registers of licenses issued between 1604 and 1616. Some other licenses are mentioned in European sources, and we have around 200 licenses issued, but we don't always know if this license corresponds to an actual travel. On the other hand, we have 150 more occurrences of Japanese ships abroad, but we don't know if they received a license or not. So here is one of these documents. It's a very easy document to read. You see, it's very short. You have the destination, the provenance, Japan, and here you have the destination, which is one of the names for Central Vietnam, and you have the date here and the seal. So during this short period of time, we have around 350 ships or licenses issued, or ships who went to Southeast Asia. Apart from these very specific corpus, you have also a lot of official diplomatic documents written in Chinese or in Japanese, which were gathered in the 19th century in huge compilation. The most important of this compilation is the Tsuko Ichiran from the mid-19th century, with more than 350 volumes of documents on the relationships, on the foreign relations of Japan. We also have documents from the Nagasaki interpreters. So the Tosen Fusetsugaki, which are the oral reports from the Chinese captains translated into Japanese, because when the Chinese captains arrived in Nagasaki, they had to give a speech to explain where they came from and these kind of things, and it was translated into Japanese. It was the main function of the translator of Chinese. And this translator also had a diary that they used, that is very important also to highlight the foreign relations of Nagasaki at this time. These are for the official or semi-official documents. We also have letters, a few letters written by Japanese traders. The most important of them are the dozen of letters written by a Japanese from Vietnam, from present-day Vietnam, in Hoi An, he and his relatives wrote a dozen of letters sent to Japan in the 1660s, 70s, as you can see. And they are very important because they talked about trade, but they also talked about religion, how to keep a kind of Japanese way of life when you live abroad. For example, there are lists of food that the Japanese trader wants to import into Vietnam, these kind of things. We also have 3 letters in Japanese from half Japanese women who were in Batavia, who were expelled to Batavia in the 1630s, and they sent a few letters to Japan, to their relative in Japan. But these are actually the only letters in Japanese, so where you can really have a glimpse at the voice of the actors, because we have another set of letters written by Japanese merchants, translated into Dutch, but they have the translation. They are translated into Dutch, and they are included in the journal of the Castle of Batavia, on the Dagregister. So these are also very important, but they are in Dutch. We don't have the original. After these Japanese and Southeast Asian sources, I would like to highlight the European sources, which are unlimited wealth of sources about the foreign relations of the countries in Asia and Southeast Asia. So in my research, I mainly used the source of the East India Company, because the East India Company spent only 10 years in Japan, but they produced a lot of documents at this time. The most famous is the Diary of Richard Cox, which is full of details about relations between Japanese authorities, Chinese traders, and European traders. And we also have logbooks, so travel narratives from William Adams, Edmund Sayers, who were the English traders employed by the East India Company. And they are very important actually, because they are one of the earliest sources we have on certain ports like Hoi An ever. So you have the East India Company sources. You also have, of course, the Dutch sources, the sources from the Dutch East India Company. In my research, I only used edited and printed Dutch sources, but they are also obviously more important. But there are more manuscripts and written sources than edited one. So I used the journal of the VOC factories. You have journals in Batavia, in Japan, Hirado, Nagasaki, in Taiwan as well. And you have other sets of letters and documents which were written at that time, the Generale Missive, the Bataviaanse Uitgaanbriefboek. So letters sent from Asia to Europe. And you have also, as I told you, an infinite wealth of digitized archives, because the majority of the VOC archives are digitized and freely available online. And you have obviously also the missionary archives. The one I used the most were the archives from the Jesuit archives in Rome, especially the collection Japonica Sinica, which was really important for me because it was the only corpus the Japanese didn't find before me. So I was really happy for that. You have here a narrative about the hostility of the Japanese in Hoi An towards the missionaries. So Jesuit sources, I only have a glimpse at what we can find in cross-cultural relations in the Jesuit sources. I also use the Archives des MEP, des Missions étrangères de Paris, interesting from the 1660s and after that. And I went yesterday for the first time of my life to the Biblioteca Ajuda, where I realized that there were still many Jesuit sources to work on these kind of topics. So the missionary, I don't use the missionary sources to write a history of the missions. Of course, I use it to write a history of their trading activities, all the trading activities of their converts, their activities as brokers between local authorities and foreigners, and for the religious life of the converts and also of the non-Christians, when you can have some information about that. I will be very quick on the iconographic sources, but we can discuss it in the question. So we have some pictures of ships, as you can see, pictures of interviews between Japanese traders and Vietnamese authorities. You have two scrolls. So this one from the 17th century, where you have here an interpreter, and this one from the 18th century, which represent the same kind of things, an interview. And here you have a Japanese trader entertained during one of his travel to Southeast Asia. So I will conclude briefly with the new material and perspective, because here I showed you what I've been working on, and now I will briefly talk about what I want to work on later. So another corpus, it's not the 17th century. Unfortunately, we don't have much before the 19th century in Vietnam, but we have the administrative sources from the Nguyen dynasty, which ruled Vietnam from the early 19th century. I don't know this corpus. I know the Chaoban, so I'm starting to work on that. The second corpus is the Hankacho in Nagasaki, which are judiciary sources about Nagasaki, about the train in Nagasaki, and hopefully about smuggling as well. And this is the topics I want to work on through the previous sources I've presented and this one. First, the circulation of Southeast Asian products to and into Indo-Japan. The functions and role of castaways from Southeast Asia in Japan and of Japanese castaways in Southeast Asia. And one of the thing I want to do is to write a longue durée history of the Vietnamese port of Hoi An. And since I have a little bit talked too much, I will stop here. Thank you very much. Okay.
Okay. Okay, now we'll. Okay. Okay.
I thought it was 20 minutes, sorry.
No problem. Let's move on with the next paper, and then
Okay.
we'll have a section of.
I thought we had 20 minutes and 10 minutes of questions, that's why. Okay.
Well, it's in the program. Nobody contested the program. Okay. Perfect. Okay.
So
We may have okay. Let's move on with the following guest. Is Paula from École Française d'Extrême-Orient. At sea without danger, incursion and into Chinese written sailing direction. Book. Please.
Okay. Many thanks. So today I will just, my topic today is just to present you some research that I'm not the only one who do it at this moment. We are a group that working on sailing instruction books. And but I just want to present it to you one, and even if also it's a little bit on the on the border of our topics, I just want to present it because it's a Chinese sources, but I think that we found European sources. Probably the European sources will help us at the end to understand how to use exactly this kind of sources.
You wanted to share the PowerPoint?
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, but no, it was because I just do it this morning and I don't remember what I put it.
You want to share it now? Okay.
The problem is that I cannot. I don't know what I put it in.
No problem. No problem. Just
Chair. Sorry. I think that it was already done. Okay, I'm sorry.
It was.
No, I think that it was already done. Okay. It's
Okay.
Yeah. So,
And then you can put this.
yeah, but this is the problem is that I need to
Okay.
know to see what the next, because I didn't remember. It's
Like this.
on the. But this is not okay for you?
Yes. It's okay this
It's
way.
okay, yeah.
Okay.
So the name that you at sea without danger, it's donc the name, it's a title. It's a title I put on gimme. It's a sailing instruction books that I received some years ago during a research field trip in the Bahu archipelago. It was a Taiwanese colleague, Professor Li Mingzhu of the National Bahu University of Science and Technology, who gave me this sailing direction books in hope that I will study it and publish the result of this research. This unexpected gift stimulated the member of a working group that already started to work on the subject to set up a research project on nautical practices on China seas, based partly, but not exclusively, on this type of professional books. And there is plenty to do. In fact, if the existence of these writers is not in doubt, at least for the modern period, many other questions remain to be resolved. To start by understanding how they were used and by whom. Thus, some of us began to conduct extensive research on this document, including the analysis of the document and use, as well as of the writing processes and transmission, the comparison between them, etc. This fundamental work should also enable us to better apprehend the navigation practices and technique of Chinese sailors. But because the information provided by these professional sailing instruction books is not always easy to understand or comprehensive, we have also decided to compare them with the Portuguese, Dutch, and English nautical instructions of that period and for the same seas. In fact, European ships at that time used local Asian pilots, especially at the beginning of the arrival of the European in the Asian seas, and the captain, unlike the Chinese one, recorded all the information useful for navigation. Thus, the silence of Chinese sources could perhaps be partly compensated by European documents. This work of comparison should also make it possible to highlight the technical borrowing and certain phenomena of hybridization between Asia and Europe. This document, so at sea without danger, is a sailing direction book of some 80 pages, undated and untitled Haipuyangbo, literally meaning the sea does not rise waves or the sea is without danger. I mean, just in this context, because in another context, the same sentence could be means the situation is peaceful or something like that. There is no problem, no danger on the sea, but not because of navigation, but about piracy or some danger from outside, etc. So the title of this, in this case, is indicate the scope of the book, ensure and safe navigation. In other words, the title already suggests that the content will give the required knowledge needed by a captain or pilot to bring the vessel safely to harbor. But was this title an original one? Or was it added later when it was last copy? This just to introduce one of the first questions this kind of document raises. Its translation is underway, and except the place name, The text poses, at first glance, no major problems once the professional and regional jargon have been identified and understood. Nevertheless, its translation, and especially the projection of at least one of the proposed routes on a map confronted us with a major problem. The destination point does not correspond to the same place of destination specified in the text. So when you just follow, you put all the waypoint on you plot all the waypoint on the map, and with the time, etc., you don't arrive at the same place than normally the text, the destination at the same text. So this is probably one of the biggest, also another big problem that we need to answer. All this preliminary explanation for saying that this literature is still all mysteries, and we are still pondering how we can use them and which kind of information we can collect from them in order to improve our knowledge about navigation, commercial route, and fishery. But before we will be able to answer all those questions arise, I think that we need first to carry out the translation of important part of this kind of documents and to compare several sailing instruction books. Through comparison of itinerary segment, we can perhaps also highlight the differences and understand if they could possibly be classified into families. So when I say that there is a lot of people who work on them, me, Pierre Mangan, also, no, not really Angela, but Elke Papelitsky, Zheng Weizhong, etc. That work. We want to put all the we now with Angela project. We just try to put all the segment, because there is a lot of segment and not books, but all the segment of sailing instruction book in a database, just and put and plot all this information on maps and look what we can really extract from that. This is the project on the road now. So before considering this manuscript and the problem it raises, let me first say some words about this kind of literature. Like for their counterpart in Europe, Chinese sailors rely on oral knowledge for their navigation, but this expertise or part of it is also recorded in written documents that we commonly call sailing instructions books or ratters, and in China under the name already mentioned, and in China we use the name Shuilubu. So you have the translation, Shuilubu or Genlubu or Jianglubu. So normally when you look at that and you look especially at the Chinese character, you think that probably they are different, but in almost all the case, they are the same. I mean, they propose the same information. Without some exception, the Yale maps, the Shunfeng-Xiangsong, and for example, but also for some years now, the Selden map, until the recent past, these documents have not drawn the attention of scholars working on Asian maritime history, also because they modest number. Or to be more correctly, they have not been studied from a technical point of view. The only sailing direction that have already been studied a little bit are those that have been inserted or published in scholarly work, as for example, the Shunfeng-Xiangsong, or included in some geographical work presenting maritime routes to Southeast Asia. And naturally, I have not forgotten the Zhenhe maps included in the military encyclopedia of Ma Yongyi, the Wu Beizhi, and the already known and studied essay of Ma Guang, the Yin Yang Shanglan. Over the last few years, Chinese scholars have begun to systematically collect sailing direction books from fishermen, especially for the Nanyang, the Southeast China Southeast, and have already initiated the publication. Thus, we can already read and study some part of them, like those presented in Zhongguo Li Dai Hai Lu Zhenjing, the Chinese historical sea pilots, published by Chen Tiazhong and Zhu Jianqiu. following among the sailing direction books, distinction should be made following the information they provide or the way in which this information is presented. First difference should be done between the common practical sailing instruction. I think common because more frequent, prepared probably by the sailor themselves, and but prepared by the sailor themselves, but who really write these kind of documents, because this information are for the majority in a writing form and not with illustration, etc. But these are the most, until now, are the most important document that we have. I mean, the most important, the majority of the document that we used are in a written form and not others. And the second one is the sailing instruction books that are present, but they are they present the topography and they illustrate the coastal line or the coastal more often the highland, the coast of highland, and some hydrographic future of the route, and these are illustrated. They are illustrated books, but sometimes, I mean, with some inscription, and then we have another third category entre guillemets that they mix the both. I mean, they have, in my majority they present a writing form, but we can also find some illustration, especially I think, but it's not sure because we are just at the beginning of our comparison. Probably the most difficult places for the navigation, we can also find the illustration, and this we can find it. For example, we have some documents like Chinese. I mean, it's a Chinese document, but copied by a Japanese diplomat, and we have also a very interesting document of this kind of this source category that it was sailing writers founded by officials of the British Navy in the middle of the 19th century on board a pirates ship, and then I'm trying to translate, because probably this one is perhaps one of the most important documents that really can perhaps would help us to really understand the nature of these documents. When I spoke about the nature, is because, you know, a lot of, I mean, the most known and so forth until now, the most important sailing instruction are not really the sailing instruction, are collection of sailing instruction, and this was and this is a work of scholar. I mean, it's scholar work, and it's not a sailor work. And this is for the Chou-Fin-Sianson, but we can also find, for example, the Dong Xiang or Essay on East and West Ocean. They are interesting. They for sure. I mean, about the segment of sailing instruction, it's okay, but they cannot help us to understand what was a sailing instruction books used. I mean, if it exists, using by the Chinese sailors. That one, and so we have this one, the collection of sailing instruction book written by scholars, but we have also some other books that have been drafted with the purpose of instructing officials and eventually also member of the local elite about some important questions related to the management of the coastal region and seafaring knowledge. Thus, some of these latest could be considered as practical handbook, as apply the first sentence of scholar military men of the 17th century, 18th century, Litiniu, we specified that, and they say, I don't know if we have this one. Sorry, I didn't remember what I put on mine. So this was the illustration, the sailing book with illustration. This was in the. This is one of the first one founded in the middle of the 20th century in Shanghai, and this one is one from my the pirates ship taken on the pirate ships, and so I don't know if I take it. No, I didn't take it. Anyway, so. When we look at the handbook, military handbook of the coastal region, we can also find a lot of document of this kind. I mean, not a lot. It's not document. I mean, we have chapter, or we have chapter on sailing instruction, where we can find sailing instruction, but we can also find other information for the navigation and about geography or hydrography information, and this is also confirmed in military from the Ming Dynasty on. It is said that military officials, I mean especially the officer, high-ranking official, need to have some knowledge on sailing. On nautical knowledge for conduct action along the coast. So now just so about Berna, because as you can understand, we don't really know. I mean, we don't know exactly. We cannot say what was really an nature of this kind of documents, because with the most the most important one are collection, not specific sailing instruction books, and especially these kind of books and the books that came also until us, especially, for example, the books that I received in the Bahu, but also other one for the fishermen that they collected now in Hainan, etc. I mean, these kind of books, they are, they are copy, they have been copy and copy and copy. So we don't know the origin, and the content could also be being changed from a period to another. So it is very difficult to know, to understand what was a specific sailing book, and it's for this reason that perhaps these pilots, this writer found it on this pirate, what do you say, this pirate ship could be perhaps interesting, because some of the information gives they are a little bit different from the other one. So, but we are not finished. It's really a work on that we just beginning. We also know, because I mean, when we look at some scholars, I mean, normally this kind of book are secret. I mean, the information recorded in this kind of documents normally need to be, I mean, people say, and it's normal in a way, and you can understand that information that these books recorded are secret, because they perhaps they they give information, I don't know, special routes or something like that. So but now I will present you the sailing instruction that they give me. But so I spoke about the problem of the nature of this sailing instruction, and this is also important because we don't know exactly who used this book. Because when you are on board, normally you don't really have time, to read a book and know what you need to do. Normally, the pilots, Chinese pilots, like European pilots, they already know the routes. So this kind of books could be, and anyway, they are really related with the use of the compass, but the use of the compass on Chinese boats, it's in discussion because we don't know exactly if they used the Chinese compass or the European one already in the 17th century. And it's the same, when normally when you are on the road and you work on board, you don't really use every time the compass, and because you already know. The compass, when you use this kind of what you say, compass and other instances, is because perhaps you lose way after a storm or something like that. We don't know, but it's not perhaps. And when you read the description of the use of the compass in some Chinese sources, there is a lot of problem. So it is you cannot understand how it could be help for sailing when you know how they. But this is also another problem with maritime knowledge, is that the majority of information we have about navigation have been written by no sailors. They are scholars who understand nothing or very few about navigation. So what they say was what they probably have understand, or what some other told them, etc., etc. It's never the first-hand knowledge. And even if you can say that it's first-hand knowledge because they are on the boat, it is not sure that they really understand what the sailors told them. So for us, after, it's more difficult to understand how this document has been, had really been used at that time. So that, just for finish, I just want to show you the content of this. So I just show you this one because I received it, and I promise that we will do something. So it's for sure that we will do something. But the information we can find in this one, it's almost the same that we can find in other. When they are the same, between bracket, comprehensive, because we have a lot of sailing instructions that they are just segments, found on military handbooks or in other sources. So in this one, because the content of the manuscript is divided into some 96 small sections. Some of them deal with what we probably can consider a specific aspect of a common nautical knowledge. Nevertheless, the majority of them are constituted by sailing direction instruction. The document begins with giving the general information about auspicious and inauspicious days for some activity, such as departure, shipbuilding, etc. Is this one, for example. Another section is devoted to monthly auspicious cyclical days, It is followed by another one in which it is specified a different moment for safely departure and the launch of a new vessel, and the end ends with the list of the auspicious day for the loading. When we find, then we find another statement saying that for sailing and loading ship, it is necessary to choose again auspicious days, etc., etc., etc. Follow after that, follow 11 guideline about how to maneuver and conduct and the ship, and the important things that we should be available on board during critical situations. For example, when sailing downwind, but with a violent wind, it is necessary to reduce sails and take shelter into harbor. I mean, they give you some, some advice. They advise also about when you are followed by probably pirates' ships. So they advise you the best things to do at that moment and that. They also give you some information about utensils that you need to have on board, etc. And also they give you information about the rituals that you need to do on board, and also of medicine. After this, concrete, advice, there are considerations about whether followed by a list of direct destination written in a short way, which aim is perhaps to help with the memorizing of the distance. For example, like that, Bajau, this one. So the Bajau and Dalu are located on the same diagonal formed by the direction to and way, and from Bajau it takes Tugen to arrive in Dalu. So these are segment of, we can also say that it's segment of sailing instruction, but they are very short. Just one, they give you just one destination, and it's for this reason that they say why they do that, because they repeat, because this kind of information we also find in another more developed sailing instruction. And so perhaps it's an idea, perhaps they just put this long list of just one destination, just for the memorizing the destination and the direction that you need to use to go from one point A to point B. But I mean, but this is just one idea. So after after we have more complete sailing instruction, but I don't read now because it's already time to reading gone. And this one, for example, from Xiamen to Guangdong, etc. And they also give you information about, for example, sea depth, but also about the depth, for example, inside and outside an harbor, the water surrounding, the presence of reef and shelf also in a specific region. Also, they can also give you, but it's not sure, the nature of the sea bottom, I think, I say, and the strength of the current. And also, for example, we have 2 or 3 that they also give us the tidal race during the 12 months, but only for a region, and this region it's Haiku, and the free books give the same, so we don't know how we need to interpret this, because only Haiku and not the other one, etc., etc. So in conclusion, and after first reading of this document, what could we say about them? Our present knowledge of the subject, as you can see, is insufficient, and therefore it is still premature to detail how and by whom these different documents were used concretely, and more specifically, what was the actual use, except after a storm weather condition, and perhaps when people sail on unknown waters, but we don't know. In any case, for us, I mean, for us who are working on maritime Asia, they are important because they give us, they present us a common substract concerning the basic nautical knowledge of Chinese sailors. Not only for about the you know, the auspicious days, but they also give they give us an idea about the importance, for example, of China, of some temple along the routes, the sailing routes, etc. And they also give and probably if we really can find more different sources, more different sailing books, direction, that we can date, because this is not sure, because the sailor didn't put a date in a title on this kind of, but if we can date some information, perhaps this could also help us to understand, you know, the place, I mean, the region covered by Chinese sailors, or the destination that are more frequented by the Chinese sailors, etc., etc. So now we just, I mean, it's a little bit confused, but I mean, we have a lot of questions, and until now, not so much answer.
Okay, thank you. Let me just, voila, and share this. Now we have a British punctuality. It's, wow. Okay. Meanwhile, I realized that we have some new people arriving. We have Anna Busquets with us. Hello. Also one student here from our faculty, João Paulo Roster. Welcome. So we'll have half an hour for question and answer and debate. Please, either here or online. Online, just raise your hand. Did you raise your hand? Okay. Okay, Guillaume. Voilà.
I have a question for Pierre and Paola. Pierre, it's more about your book than the title. Because in the title, there is a Japanese neighborhood. And my question is about what kind of sources do you have about social or communities in Southeast Asia, because you show sources, diplomatic and economic sources, but do you have others that you are hiding?
So about the social life of the Japanese, the sausage imports, for example, yeah, you have missionary sources. For me, one of the most important sources, because the Japanese, many Japanese were Christians, so they were in contact with the Japanese missionaries, and the Christian missionaries, and the missionaries sometimes talk about their leader, the leader of the community, their trading activities, their religious activities, how they take a Japanese heathen symbol and turn it into a Christian symbol. So we have some information about that. In the missionary sources, the Dutch don't really talk about the social life of the people, but a little bit as well. And one of the Japanese language corpus I presented, the first one, the letters by Torre B, which is a Japanese trader in Berna. He talks about his religious and daily life, because he, as I told, he ordered like a sake or shoyu, like soya sauce from Japan to use it in Vietnam. So it's helped us determine that he wanted to have his Japanese food when in Vietnam. He also asked for clothes, these kind of things. Sometimes these are really big country, so he used it for himself, but maybe also to spread it in the community or to offer it. And he built a Japanese temple in Berna. He asked that the famous engraver made a board with the name of this temple and sent. So we have a few examples of the social and cultural life of people in this place. Okay.
Okay, just a second. No, sorry. You have to reply, right? You have a question.
Alors, moi, j'avais
Okay.
une question très précise pour Paola. Elle est en anglais. Means where you show some pictures of those documents, where are they? Archives, or where are they?
Yeah.
And how many books or documents you have with your comments?
They are not our documents. Documents are still in the library. So for example, the same institution information, the coastal same institution could be found in university, but also I've been published already in China, right? And another one, but this is still very strict because my colleague don't want to say it, but we have another one. They're still in China, but they don't know where, you know. And this is that in this administration, because there are very few ones for that, for example. And the other one, I mean, now library and in the segment of training, you can also find in local gazeteers, for example, for Baku, I mean, for the Qing dynasty, you can find a lot of, not a lot, part of them on local gazeteers, but in from the just few, they are lesser on the, but we can find a lot of, I mean, you can see in some months when we will translate the chapter on navigation of the Ocean Canal, that we also give some one, and especially but for example, back to Johnson, which was not just a collection, but we reorder, no, all the information because it's a bold information, and nobody did that. To a point, to another point, it's the same, and then you put together, and we do so it's very interesting about, for example, Johnson, so you can add information about them, and this kind of now it's everywhere.
Thank you.
Okay, I will ask Paula two small favors. The first one is if you allow me to give the word to our people online because my arm hurts. And the second one, if you could move to that chair, please, because it's not practical. Okay, we have Birgit and João Paulo making some questions. Please, Birgit, you're first.
Yes, thank you. I have two questions for Pierre-Emmanuel. The first one is methodological and the other one is kind of historiographical, I guess. To start with the methodological one, I've been wondering, and I guess I will find the answers when I read your book, but about about your focus, because in your presentation you said a couple of times I'm interested in trade relations and we need trade and diplomacy in order to understand what's going on in the South China Seas, and I completely agree. But then you also distinguish yourself for your research or your focus from the research that has been done on especially this connection between Vietnam and Japan in terms of missionary relations and Japanese Catholic diasporas. And And I've been wondering if I understood correct, or what's your take on that? Because a couple of Japanese colleagues really did excellent work, and I think in order to get the fuller picture, we definitely have to integrate that. And I think it's very closely related to what's going on in terms of trade, especially with the Jesuits refocusing on Vietnam and trying to use Vietnam, for instance, as a compensation, as a new intermediary port when they have to leave Japan after 39. And the historiographical one is, I've been a bit surprised, but I also think it's positive that you didn't use the word Japantown, or maybe I just overheard it. And I've been wondering, what's your take on, this Nihon Shinmachi scholarship that exists, and that actually, in my mind, overemphasizes a bit the Japanese presence in Southeast Asia. And in relation to that, it would also be interesting to hear if you have any sources that show the Vietnamese local perspective on exactly that relationships. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this question. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you well from some, so I'm not sure I understand your first question. So maybe I should ask you to ask once more, but I started to answer you. So for the Vietnamese sources, there are almost no Vietnamese sources except those that the Japanese found the last 100 years. So je crois qu'elle t'entend pas bien. Okay. Approche-toi.
Yes, thanks.
Okay, fine. So there are no Vietnamese sources, almost no Vietnamese sources about before the 19th century about the foreign relations of the Vietnamese. The only ones we have are the sources that the Japanese brought to Japan in the 17th century. So the letters, like the one I showed you, like these letters, and like some documents, like when the Japanese traders came to the port and the Vietnamese authorities came and wrote a report about the Japanese coming in the town. We have one still, so epigraphic sources, one still next to the city of Hoi An with the names of Japanese traders living in Hoi An. And that's pretty much everything I think. I'm sorry I didn't hear, as I told you, I didn't hear what you said was missed in my scholarship, the presentation of the scholarship. I wanted to be very quick because I thought I had less time than actually I had. But the first scholarship I've mentioned is the Japanese language scholarship about the Nihonmachi, about the daimyo. And what I wanted to add to this scholarship is the questions of cross-cultural relations, the question of networks, because in my book I also do a little bit of network analysis. Mm-hmm. I wanted also to discuss the relative, what the term, the word Nihonmachi, actually the place we call Nihonmachi is not really Nihonmachi, or we have to define what we mean when we say Nihonmachi, because actually we have a few Japanese marrying Vietnamese or Thai or Cambodian women and having children of mixed heritage. These children sometimes take a Chinese name so they can trade in East Asia. So yes, I don't want to say that, because I think you mentioned the overemphasizing of the Japanese presence. I think this presence was really important in the 17th century, in the first part of the 17th century, and after that they were still important as intermediaries and brokers between the European and the Vietnamese for the Vietnamese part. But, this is why I want to emphasize. This is why I was interested in Vietnam, early modern Vietnam, so in Dai Viet, because in Dai Viet the Japanese kept this important position in the country at least until the 1670s, or at least when I said the Japanese, I said the Japanese and their children actually, which are of mixed heritage. And yes, I'm really sorry I didn't grasp your first question.
No, thanks. It's fine. I guess other people want to say something. The first question was more about the missionary angle that is studied in Japan among Japanese scholars.
Okay.
That I think that could be useful to look into that.
Okay. Actually, the missionary is not my main focus. I had a very I use the missionary sources just to add new data on the activity of the Japanese in early modern Vietnam, actually. And because I knew that there were a lot of things written about the missions and the missionaries in particular, and what I found is that what was really important for me in the missionary sources is that it gave me a kind of full picture of the evolution of the Japanese community from the 1610s to the 1680s, to see the different phases of this community, what they've been through, etc. But I didn't really focus on their practices, because their practices the thing is, when the Jesuits write about the Japanese, they just have these very standardized histories of Japanese converts converting in extremis before dying, or these kind of things. So yeah, I don't know if I answer your question properly, but try to.
Okay, João Paulo.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I would like to do a question to Pierre Emmanuel also about the Japanese presence in Macau, despite of the Chinese bans on Japanese in Macau. We know about this presence, and if the sources that you have been using tells us something about this.
Okay, thank you for the question. Yes, I've seen some of I have some information about the Japanese in Macau, because my perspective was to study the relations between Japan and Vietnam, but to replace it into a regional network. And in this regional network, Macau is of course important. The thing is, Macau is one of the earliest places where the Japanese were not allowed officially to go, because you have the Madre de Deus incident in Japan in 1610, and 1608, 1610, the Japanese are not allowed to go to Macau. They continue to go to Macau because 10 years later, the shogunate say, please say to the traders they are not allowed to go to Macau, so they still go to Macau. And this is something that is very, we can see that in the Dutch and missionary sources, once again, is that the Vietnam-based Japanese traders were in contact with Macau, or in contact with Japanese in Macau. For example, you have heard about Cristóbal Ferreira in the movie by Scorsese, and when the information was given of his death and of his rejection of Christianity was given to the Japanese in Vietnam by a Japanese in Macau. The Japanese in Vietnam said, this Japanese in Macau told me that Cristóbal Ferreira had rejected Christianity and this kind of things. We also have Japanese captains going from Manila to Macau to Hoi An in Vietnam. So yeah, it was one of the important place where the Portuguese, where the Japanese traded and had contacts. And you have, in the second part of the 17th century, a lot of Portuguese Japanese missionaries born and bred in Macau, who go to Southeast Asia to do missionary work as well.
Okay. Thank you, João Paulo. Paula?
Yes,
At last.
About what you say about these letters of women, Japanese women letters. And so could you say more, a little bit more about who they are? And
Okay, yeah, no problem. So we have 3 of these letters. They were not translated into a Western language, I think. I'm not sure actually. And these women were 3 mestizos from Dutch father and Japanese mother, and they were expelled in the 1630s from Japan in between the 1635 edict banning the Japanese from leaving the country and the expulsion of the Portuguese. So it was between the 1636 and 1638. They were expelled with their fathers and some of their mothers, and they went to Batavia. And there are some documents about them. So we know that the woman who wrote the most famous letter was involved in a very complicated divorce drama. And this, if you want to know a little bit more about that, you can read the book by Nodo Asia, which is this is one of these women, and these letters have been used to show how even 30 to 40 years after leaving Japan, they still mastered the Japanese language, and this has been used also as to show the emotional connection these kind of people could keep towards Japan. And yeah, what is interesting about one of these letters is that it was so this Cornelia von Uwedrode wrote to her mother and father-in-law in Japan, and says that she's really sad not to be in contact with Japan. And but we know that she was also involved in business in Batavia. We have the testament of another Japanese in Batavia who give money to her.
Okay. Miguel has a question. So, please.
So I understand you don't have a template that says. I understand that you don't have a template that says these were table instructions. My question is, what about?
This is my, I'm sorry, this is my idea.
So what about other nautical cultures, let's say in East Asia, such as Japan or Korea? Did they produce nautical instructions that how do they resemble the nautical instructions that that are in Chinese? And furthermore, at some point in time, I guess Chinese Navy must have generated its own nautical instructions. So what are the traditions of those nautical instructions, and how do they relate, if at all, with the nautical instructions that you have?
So for the first one, I cannot answer. I'm just beginning to China, and we're already there's so much to do that I don't work in Japanese and Korean. That's not even myself by now. About and after you speak about the Navy, the problem of the Navy that I say that we have a lot of teams, but they are just saying, or something. And they are produced by officers, but and probably they are used to train officers or soldiers or but the majority of documents, not only for the navigation, but as the military document for training troops and officers, they are in a manuscript form. So we lost a lot of these kind of documents. So we don't have any idea about we don't have an idea about the contents of one and another one to be found in another subject. For example, you know that in Badoga, the famous Ming Dynasty officials also wrote something like that on the subject, but the books are low, so we don't know. We don't know the exact content of this. And when I'm just sometimes I'm just wondering, you know, about. I'm sure that for the segment, you know, the same institution is okay, it's but about the composition, what we have. Just I have just some dots, you know, because actually for the information they give us, they are interesting for us. They could be actually interesting for the scholar at that time who don't have information about coastal life or say or life on seas, you know. But I mean, they give us normal knowledge that I mean, and common, and it's common knowledge for our thinkers. Not for us, but for our thinkers, yes. So did need, I mean, what by the effort need, yeah.
Okay, we have Harriet Lundorfer, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
With regard to the remark about Japanese in Macau, I recall a rather interesting book called The Mirror of Japan, which was written by Chen Chong-gung. Chen Chong-gung was sent by the governor of Zhejiang province to Japan in the middle of one of the worst Wako raids on China. And he stayed in Japan long enough to observe many aspects of Japanese life. It's very interesting. Also, the use of katakana in the Japanese language. He left Japan and went back to China, and for whatever reason, it's still unknown, he got arrested when he got off the ship in Guangzhou. He was put in prison, and he observed the process whereby Japanese disguised as Siamese, like the Portuguese, in Guangzhou would go and do business. So according to Chung, the Japanese were, you know, piggybacking on the Portuguese trips between Hirado and Guangzhou rather early, and built up a Japanese presence in Guangzhou, even if it was in disguise. And his book, Urban Ichen, is a very rare book. The only way I could get a copy of it was the very ambitious librarian who knew somebody in the National Library of Beijing who made a digital copy for me. I think there are only 3 or 4 copies in the world of the book, but it's really fascinating. And if you have the chance to read it, you learn a lot about how close the Japanese and the Portuguese were in the silk for silver trade and the effects on the building of Macau as a kind of international multi-culti stopping point between Southeast Asia and Japan. That's all I want to say.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a final question.
I have one question for Pierre and one question for Paula. Yeah, you mentioned the work of Richard White as an important work for your research. Richard White, the middle ground. Could you tell us a little bit more about how the middle ground works in your space? Because I find it interesting to know how a phenomena that you see in other places can be also seen in this context. And for Paola, I was wondering, you tell us, you have this hardship because your source
was written for a more learned public, was written. It's not a manual for sailors, but it's learned literature. Why would they do that? Why were, I don't know, Mandarin or the highest country, why some people interested in such kind of literature?
Okay, thank you for the question. Actually, I found the book by which was truly fascinating because it was two groups that didn't know anything about each other, and they came together and they found some way to communicate. So when I read this book, I wondered how can this apply to East Asia, and especially in my context to groups that have something in common, which was not the case with the French and Native Americans. So
As the English, but also
yes. And in Asia, you have so the Vietnamese and the Japanese who share similar values. They have the Chinese language. They share the Chinese language as a way of communicating and as a way of and they were instructed in the Chinese languages, in the Chinese Confucian principles, etc. And wanted to know if that the communication was, if they can understand each other immediately because they had this in common. I wanted to ask this question, and what was really interesting that when you look at the first communication between the Vietnamese and the Japanese, you see that yes, they have something in common. They speak the same written language, which is Chinese, but there are some practices that are different from in each part of the Chinese Seas. So they had to build a common ground, a middle ground, just as the French, the English, and the Native Americans had to do, but it was easier. And I use the metaphor of the middle ground in the chapter about the diplomacy, and to see how was the common ground created between Japanese authorities and Vietnamese authorities. And when I saw that the Diet at that time was divided in two different kingdoms or states, as you wish. And in the third one, it was they had this common ground, but they couldn't understand each other because there were some conflicts about using this kind of title, which was not appropriate. But in the southern part, the communication was really easy, and they could build this common ground. So I think that what I found is that the communication and the common ground was not immediate. There was nothing automatic about understanding each other. Even when you have the Chinese language and practices shared, and that the Japanese authorities had different responses to these the building of common understanding.
I can just ask, because I mean, they want to say, what about the Chinese? I mean, the Chinese people have to
Yes, if I knew that I had 30 minutes, I would have had. I missed something in my sources is that I don't really know. There are still Chinese sources about the trading context environment of the South Asian in the 17th century. So I didn't have many Chinese sources, and I'm not sure there are many Chinese sources about the 17th century relations. We have one of the most famous is Tashan, who went to Vietnam in the late 17th century. But what we know is that of course, the Chinese were very, very important. And the Chinese were very important at the time of the Japanese period of Huai'an in the early 17th century. It's not that clear if the Chinese were as well settled in Vietnam as well the Japanese. But when the Japanese cannot come from Japan from the 1630s. It is clear that the Chinese completely replaced the Japanese, and that the Japanese actually meted themselves in the Chinese community of Japan.
Last transition, there is so many people.
Yes, yes, of course. And they found something that is quite peculiar to Vietnam, which is the Minh community, which are the Minh refugees community who gathered first in Hoi An and after that in many different places in Vietnam, and they succeeded in gaining an official status in Vietnam as kind of middle communities between the Chinese and the Vietnamese. Yes, and I would like to work on the Minh as well. I gathered some documents in Hoi An about the Minh as well. Hopefully, I can extend my work to the Chinese.
Okay. So now we're talking about no. So I mean, for someone, you know, that I mean, so from I mean, for official of the Navy, this is sure the training so it's okay. For the other, for example, for the sugar and corn, I mean, it says when you read the presentation, I mean, the picture, he explained that this was for he said that he was afraid about Toulouse and information. And also we see that he also write for the travel lovers because we want to travel and then information about that, for example. And for example, for Jiangxi, for Dongxiacao, it was the 17th century. I mean, Jiangxi is on the boats because official to région was the Chinese authority opened in 1567. The only one the Chinese people to abroad, and then at the end of the 17 and 17, they need to adjust, you know, for the taxes and a lot of things. And so they ask some people, and they ask Jiangxi people that they don't see what they pay write this book using a lot of school and sources, and also sources that are more at the same time than but he also asked a lot of, he said that in the introduction, he said that he asked him to speak a lot with tailors, with merchants, he went to Southeast Asia because what was important for the authority at that moment was the knowledge about Southeast Asia. So this is what we do, for example, for this kind of scholarly collection of.
Okay, thank you. Since there are no more questions, we will take a break of about half an hour. We will be back on 4:35. Thank you. See you then.
Not recorded, so because it's already late, it's really late for such I think you just
How are you, Brigitte?
I'm good.
Are good?
I was about to say it's only us, but it's not true.
Okay. We are not alone, but don't worry.
We are back in business.
Wait. Hi.
So let's proceed. We have just a second. Okay. Just a small detail about Wei Chung Chang. Thank you for your participation. Please feel free to just go to sleep if you'd like to. The same applies, of course, to Mark Dizon, who is in Manila, and we guess it's late in there. So please feel free to leave the session, and unless you have insomnia. So if you'd like to stay with us. Okay, let's go on. Now we'll have the second part of this session. The following one is Birgit Tremmel-Werner from Linnaeus University in Sweden. Hello, Birgit. She will present a paper called Sources and Archives for Studying Filipino Diplomacy in the 17th Century. Please.
Thank you very much, Paolo, for the introduction and also for the invitation. I'm sharing my screen now. I hope it works. Yes, so my contribution today is entitled Sources and Archives for Studying Philippine Diplomacy in the 17th Century. And just now, I guess also listening to the other presentations, I realized that this might be slightly misleading, because unlike the previous speakers, I will not introduce concrete sources or concrete contents of written sources on this very topic, but try to share with you some general reflections about the nature of the archives and what it actually needs, or what I think it needs, what we should do if we want to get a fuller understanding and picture of what I refer to as diplomacy or foreign relations of the Philippines in the 17th century. And as I also wrote in the expose for my paper, the big question, of course, is, or the first question we have to ask ourselves is whether it makes sense to talk about Philippine diplomacy in the 17th century. Because to some extent, of course, it seems like both an ahistorical idea and an anachronistic concept applied from the present to the past. But it is, as you will see, that I will argue, a suitable analytical frame. Because foreign relations and negotiations, alliances, communication practices have been at the heart of studies trying to understand political shifts and power bargaining, also commercial processes and state intervention, as part of all sorts of cross-cultural encounters, also colonial ones, in the China Seas and the land below the winds. And we have seen that today already in various papers. So the dynamics of negotiations and their effects on political, social, economic, and environmental processes should thus be approached from new diplomatic history. And new diplomatic history seeks alternatives to the master narrative of the sovereign state. The new impetus comes from focusing on a multitude of actors, practices, multilingual and multicensual sources, and the awareness of co-created narratives. And this is what my talk will be about. And in order to illustrate that, I added this stamp here, which you can see, a stamp commemorating the first Filipino-Spanish Treaty of 1565. And that, of course, is quite controversial to understand the moment that is otherwise known as the beginning of Spanish colonization and the conquest of the Philippines by the Spaniards, that in itself can also be understood as a form of negotiations, at least, that happened and that were an important element of the processes that were set in motion afterwards. And another very important aspect is to include different narratives, but also different actors and different practices of how these negotiations looked like. And most commonly, when we think about diplomacy and diplomatic sources, we think of written original documents. But they, of course, are very problematic when it comes to such asymmetrical relations, or the encounter between different groups, where certain groups, for instance, did not have a writing style, or did not have a tradition of recording the encounters, not a tradition of producing written documents, such as the treaties. And the treaties, of course, what was commemorated in relation to 1565. But the Philippine or the indigenous Philippine side, of course, had other diplomatic practices that are important to consider. And one is illustrated here in this diorama at the Ayala Museum, the so-called Sandugo de Blood Compact that was allegedly or not carried out between the indigenous party and the Spanish party, and was in combination with written treaties part of these negotiations and agreements of future alliances and collaboration. So these are just several aspects, so to say, to set the ground for what I'm trying to do, to create a more nuanced picture of negotiations and diplomatic relations that included the area what is today known as the Philippines. What I'm going to do now in the rest of my presentation is I will first think about the geography of the diplomatic exchange, and then, that's the main and the longer part, introduce several themes in 17th century diplomacy. And in order then to move on to reflect on the diplomatic archive, and also the misleading narratives that are part of the diplomatic archive, but then can actually be quite fruitful in order to go beyond the meta-narrative of negotiations between, well, polities and also sovereign states. And I will end with some ideas about new approaches. So the geography, and that is also not new, and I'm also very grateful to the previous papers that already introduced this very dynamic South China Sea space that extends into the north, that is not only maritime, but that also actually has quite a strong territorial dimension with Ming and Qing Empire, but also, and here I totally agree with Mark Dison, who argues that we need to have an integrated approach between East and Southeast Asia in order to understand the broader historical processes and dynamics here. And that is certainly also true for the diplomacy and geopolitics of the 17th century. So basically all the entire areas you see here, and the neuralgic spots, some of them are port cities, other are larger polities. They were all somehow involved in diplomatic exchange of envoys, letters, trade agreements that included sometimes explicitly parties in the Philippines, and sometimes only indirectly. And the list on the left-hand side obviously is incomplete, but should just give you an idea of which polities were considered particularly important. So then to move on to the themes in global diplomacy, I suggested we think about certain categories, and not all of these categories are invented by me. Some of them have been around for quite a while, and I think that's mainly due because of the increased interest in diplomacy and trade, and the understanding of negotiation processes of part of the different encounters in the South China Sea, and also the land beyond the winds, and this idea of an increased cross-cultural, intercultural engagement and collaboration in the region, be it in order to increase global commerce, exchange between various stakeholders, or just other mobilities, migration processes, etc. So for the Philippines in particular, for the 17th century, Philippines and the 17th century, of course, also should be understood as long 17th century. Of course, it doesn't really make sense to think of 100 years of very specific or particular developments. So, and now for the long 17th century, for the Philippines, we have something that is could be called a governor general diplomacy, and it's actually a term I borrowed from Ubaldo Yacarino, who has looked into the diplomatic relations of the Manila-based Spanish governor general and the diplomatic exchange. So that includes the sending of envoys, the sending of official trading vessels, official diplomatic letters, sending of diplomatic gifts, etc., from Manila towards certain other rulers and polities in East and Southeast Asia. And famous examples, of course, include Japan, but also Siam and Cochin, China. And this is, of course, a very important aspect to understand the importance of such diplomatic relations for the Spanish colonizers in the regions, and the need to have alliances and good relations, to be in good terms, and to define the terms of especially of commerce, but also of the treatment of members of the Spanish Empire. And played such a very important role for the Spanish administration and the Spanish presence in Southeast Asia. However, the problem with governor general diplomacy is that it just looks at one aspect of diplomatic relations, and it also to some extent reproduces the idea that diplomacy can only be carried out between rulers and sovereign polities. Nevertheless, before I move on, here comes one of these mini case studies of governor general diplomacy, and that to some extent has already been introduced today, or some elements of it, and it links or frames this broader trade relations into which Manila, but also Nagasaki, Macau, we heard today, Hoi An, other port cities became integrated during the 16th and 17th century, and several Asian agents and stakeholders were interested in reaping off the profits of this very profitable exchange that also included obviously China, Chinese commodities, but also Southeast Asian products. And in the course of this, there were various conflicts also because of the different agendas of the actors involved. And by that I mean that obviously the governor general, as the head of the Spanish colonial administration, had very different agendas than very private Japanese merchants. So there was a lot of money involved, and that is also one of the reasons why there was conflict, why there were always jealousies, but also why an agreement based on treaties, on regulations played a very important role, and why we have for these events and episodes quite a lot of material to study how these agreements and regulations came into place and were negotiated between the different parties across various languages. And for this case here is this famous case of a conflict that involved the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Japanese, the Spanish, and others in Ayutthaya, in Siam, which led to the burning of several ships, and also the capture of and punishment of Spanish merchants in Ayutthaya. And all that, since the Spanish governor general also had an interest in maintaining these trade relations, then triggered a reaction by the governor general, Juan Niño de Tábora, who, in reaction to these events, sent several delegations to Cambodia, Cochin, China, and Siam, and also to Nagasaki in Japan. And the diplomatic delegation to Japan in 1628 included 42 Japanese who were captured by the Spaniards and Portuguese and brought back to Manila. And they were sent back to Nagasaki at the governor's cost in order to show his goodwill, and also together with a letter in which he offered friendship and correspondence. And correspondence, of course, is a source term for diplomacy, because obviously the term diplomacy was not used in the sources at that time. This is important to mention because this period already falls in the period when, according to a Japanese understanding, there were no longer official, and again, official/diplomatic relations between the Spanish Empire, the Philippines, and Japan, because they came to an end already 4 years earlier. So another quite useful category is the one of friar diplomacy, and that to some extent is very closely linked to the first category of governor-general diplomacy, because friars, and by that I mean Catholic missionaries, were very often acting as envoys or as intermediaries, either because they had the language skills, because of their increased mobility across the region, and because of their networks in the region. So they were very convenient. And the fourth aspect is probably that several rulers or state actors considered them as more neutral, and therefore based on the understanding of foreign relations and the protocol and the ceremonial of foreign relations, friars sometimes were a perfect solution in order not to lose face or to give away too much. That is one aspect of friar diplomacy. So in many of the exchange patterns, friars acted as diplomats and envoys, but that's not the entire story. I think friar diplomacy should also include the many incidents where friars, Catholic missionaries of different orders, followed their own diplomatic agenda and negotiated either with other Asian actors, other Asian rulers, also local people on the ground, but also with representatives of the European trading nations and the European monarchies, and even the Pope, on their own terms and in order to follow their own agenda. So that's in that respect, it's also interesting to look more closely into friars and missionaries, and that has also already been done, for instance, for the Franciscans by Helene Boutin, who wrote several interesting studies on that with focus on East and Southeast Asia. And we know quite a lot. There's a rather large number of famous friar diplomats. Another one that comes to mind is Victoria Ricci, on whom Ana Busquets has worked on, or Luis Sotelo, who was accompanying the famous Japanese ambassador to Spain and Rome, Hasekura Tsunenaga, in the years 1613 and 14. And I think the reason why we know so much about them, because to some extent they are linked to a sovereign state or to a future nation state, and there was some national history interest, but there were also institutions, and there was funding to look into these relations. Plus, as I already mentioned in the beginning, since they were part of rather important exchange projects, they left an approachable or accessible corpus of sources. There are many other examples of friar diplomats, and they span throughout the 17th century and also across the entire region of East and Southeast Asia that I have shown on the map before. And one example that I would like to introduce today is the Franciscan Juan Garcia Racimo, who served as an envoy, as a diplomat in the exchange between the Sultan of Banten on Java and the Spanish Governor General in Manila in the year 1669 and 1670. And he was the one carrying a letter by Abdul Fattah, so also known as Sultan Ageng, in which the Sultan, expressed his desire for an alliance with the Spaniards, probably against the Dutch. So the Sultan of Banden in the 17th century, or in the 1670s and 80s, is another example of a very active of a ruler who very actively sought foreign relations, different allies, different strategies, and tried to not only extend his territory and his influence across Java and Borneo, but also looked actively for collaborators and allies beyond what is today Indonesia. So, for instance, by sending this delegation to Manila, and that of course is possible because there was very active trade relations between all over maritime Southeast Asia, but also in later years there is attempts to establish a relationship or official relations with England and even with Denmark. So if we look into now this case of Juan Garcia Racimo, then you probably will understand what I mean by friars should be considered as diplomats in their own rights, because Juan Garcia Racimo, as I've already said, he's mobile. Obviously, he carries this letter, who obviously has certain language skills that allow him at least to pretend that he understands the original letter and has ways to translate it, and then interprets the content in Manila in the negotiations with the Governor General and the rest of the colonial administration. So he also has this intermediary function then for a Muslim, and that of course is another important or interesting element of this dynamics of especially maritime Southeast Asia. But Juan Garcia Racimo also met the Queen in Spain, Mariana de Austria, in an audience where this is not really related, as far as we know, to his work for in relation to Banden, but more in order to get support, obviously money, for the Franciscan mission in the Philippines. And what is particularly fascinating here is that one of the arguments he uses, or one of his campaigns, is actually to re-establish trade and communication again with Japan. And that, now I have already said that before, 1624 is actually considered as the date when direct exchange and all kind of commerce, direct commerce between the Philippines and Japan ends. And this is now more than 50 years later, where there's still this slur and appeal of Japan and the Japan trade that some of these friars try to use and feel comfortable to get access here to Japan, which in the end doesn't happen. But from a diplomatic history perspective, what is even more interesting is that this whole archive of diplomatic relations and negotiations that is produced in the course of this exchange with Banden, but also with Juan Racimo's agenda, is that the case of, in order to understand how to deal with this invitation by the Sultan of Banden, the Spanish authorities and also this Franciscan friar use the letter that Philip II wrote to the Emperor of China in 1580 as a template. So there's also still this important discursive element of China and Japan as the ideal foreign relations partner for the Spaniards in the Philippines that lives on for 100 years. Yet two other categories that I think are important are frontier diplomacy and indigenous diplomacy. And I don't not arguing that they are one and the same, but just for the sake of time, I look at them together because they are overlapping. And what I mean by that, I can show you with this example here of what I call a frontier diplomacy, and that's the case of Pambangan, an indigenous Datu, who also had a military function and worked for the Spaniards in the Philippines in the since the 1610s, but in the 1620s. And in this function was in very close contact with the colonial government, but with a variety of other actors. And looking into this case of the family of Diego de Maracot, we get an idea of the foreign relations practices of one of the many indigenous groups who inhabit the Philippines and engage with the Spaniards one way or another. And the important thing is here that by trying to understand what happens here in these encounters and negotiations processes, we can go beyond a narrative of indigenous, perhaps even non-literate societies as only passive participants in these foreign relations processes. But actually, this maybe unique example of this Pambangan shows us that they were very conscious in what they did and consciously also applied various diplomatic practices and modes in order to achieve their own goals. And Diego de Maracot is so particularly interesting because he actually traveled to Madrid and was received by the Council of the Indies in Madrid and also considered as an envoy of his nation, La Nación de Pampanga. But before he travels to Madrid, he meets with the Governor General, Fajardo Itenza, in 1622, and already there negotiates. There's various elements and episodes of negotiations. There is also a performative aspect when he marches into Manila and then is negotiates with the colonial government there, and eventually succeeds in receiving their support and also by receiving a license to travel to Spain. And then in Spain too, one could argue that his negotiations were successful. He received compensation for the expenses. He and his family, also his father and brother, had while fighting alongside Spaniards, while outfitting Spanish campaigns in Ternate as the third space of Pambangan foreign relations, and also by receiving a new encomienda and by having his status as cabeza de barangay and as maestre de campo reconfirmed, and also by having receiving some sort of financial compensation. So I could go into detail, and I'm happy to do so in the discussion, but I also realize that I still have a few slides, so I move on to the third aspect, and that is the idea of the diplomatic archive and the misleading narratives. And I've already touched upon various aspects, and some of it is also implicit. But the big question, of course, for diplomatic history, and probably also the first criticism one would get from more traditional diplomatic historians, is where are the documents, where are the originals, and also where are the translations of these sources that allow us to reconstruct these encounters. So, and the reason why I say this is because by that I go back to the beginning and this idea of a treaty being signed by illiterate indigenous rulers and Spanish conquistadors in 1565. Well, there is no such original. There's some references in the sources, and there's here a couple of references and copies of this treatise and the content of this treaty, and that was, of course, reproduced and spread all over the Spanish Empire already soon after the conquest of the Philippines. But it's difficult to find, just actually to find the original Spanish treaty, but not to mention a Malay copy or a copy that would qualify for that could have been used or saved or stored or preserved by the indigenous rulers. And of course, you could argue, since there were other practices involved, such a translation or such a document was not necessary at the time. Another issue with these archival sources on the history of diplomacy is, of course, I think the overemphasis on these official documents, and we've also seen it in Pierre Emmanuel's presentation. Of course, from the Sinosphere and from the Sino-Japanese context, these official letters with seals and written in a certain style, using certain language, is usually very important. It's also something that we find for Europe, that there's certain norms and protocols for how diplomatic documents should be drafted and written, and that are then considered as original. But that, of course, is insufficient if we want to go beyond this traditional narrative of state-to-state relations or relations exchanged between sovereign rulers. And when we, in the case of the Spanish Philippines, look into other source material, there is very often reference to some form of negotiation or to a specific intercultural diplomatic agent or actor in other sources that are not considered as diplomatic sources. And just one example, for instance, from the Medianata from 1652, where certain Lasek, a saintly infiel, so a non-Catholic Chinese merchant, serves as ambassador, as royal ambassador of the king of Cambodia. And there is many other examples. Another important element of the opening and up the archive of diplomatic relations is to include non-written objects, so actual objects. That of course includes the variety of diplomatic gifts that had been exchanged and sent across the region, but also, and that I already mentioned in the previous example, to think of the commercial archive and to what extent the commercial archive, the commercial records, inventories, etc., can give us an idea of a better idea of diplomatic relations. And finally, as promised, some ideas on how to go forward and how to make more sense of that. I mean, as I said, I think these four categories that I introduced, this typology of diplomacy of the Philippines in the 17th century, they are all very useful, and combining them helps. But the problem is also that some of them are exclusive, some of them have the tendency to reproduce existing narratives and inconsistencies. And what I think would help is to think of classifications based on an understanding of the different temporalities of certain encounters, in order to go beyond validating them, which had happened before and which also happened among the Spaniards themselves. When you remember the example of China and Japan, that has always received more weight and considered more important in terms of diplomatic relations. And in order also to go beyond or to how to say, to approach the dilemma of the inconsistency and the imbalance in the existence of written documents, especially to integrate the different levels of formality in diplomatic and foreign relations. And also the degree of performativity, which can that's not, I wanted to say it's easy to study them. It's not easy to study them, but one way of studying them is by trying to integrate other forms of memories, objects, the materiality of the archive, travel logs and other accounts that go beyond the idea that we need an official diplomatic document in order to study foreign relations. And then there are, of course, the official documents, and they are very crucial, they are very helpful, but sometimes they distract us. And what I've just shown is probably known to most of you. It's the seal of the letter that Tokugawa Hidetada sent to Spain, to the Duke of Lerma in 1611. And that's, and I think another challenge here is the dominance of Spain and the idea and the history of a later nation state that has an impact on what until now has been considered diplomatic relations and foreign relations, and what has been excluded or written out from that history. And that's why, for instance, the scope of frontier or indigenous diplomacy is very limited in comparison with other relations. Then, of course, there's also still the implicit international history meta-narrative based on the exchange between sovereign states. That is a common issue for diplomatic history. Then, with regard to the archive, and one thing that probably most of you have been thinking is that when I refer to sources, I always refer to the Spanish sources. Of course, that is also a big issue. And in addition, there's also a lot of inconsistencies and inaccuracies in the Spanish records that we can use. And of course, again, even with all that in mind and with the imbalance that we are facing, there is always the trouble of myths and the importance of myths, and to what extent to take them into account and to what extent to ignore them or write against them. So my suggestions then to go forward is, as I already said, emphasize the material history of diplomacy more, but also finding ways of decolonizing, but also de-Sinicizing, and by that, in lack of a better term, this also, of course, also includes the dominance of Japan in this broader historiography and the study of Southeast Asia, and obviously also to de-Hispanicize these relations. And that could be done by an attempt of localizing or thinking of a localized diplomatic history, a history of negotiations and exchange. And not done yet. It would be interesting if an actor network analysis of different diplomatic actors, such as Freie actors and other merchants, would bring useful results. But that only the future will show us. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Birgit.
Thank you.
Now, and share, okay. Just here, okay. Now we'll have the final paper for today is Guillaume, Université Toulouse, Jean Jaurès from ESPA, Entre dos Águas, different sources about the presence of Chinese communities in Manila in the 17th century. Okay, Guillaume, come here.
I can put it on.
It's a PDF. It works? Yeah, just a question here of moving this. Okay. This is just for us here in the room, please.
Okay. Thank you, Paulo. Buenas tardes. Entre dos aguas, it's a quote like the title of Paula, but it's a quote of a song of Paco de Lucia. It's a guitarist that I like very much, but I will explain after why I choose this, but you can imagine, I think. So the Chinese presence in Manila area is the result of mobility between southern Fukien and the Philippines. Ancient trade routes connect those two areas, but with the conquest of Manila in 1571 by the Hispanics and the arrival of American silver every year by the Manila galleon, this presence increased strongly. We know the main origins of the migrants, for example, with the Selden map from the 1600, voilà. At the beginning of the 17th century, the two major cities were, I won't pronounce it like Paola, but I will do it as the French way, Zhangzhou and Guangzhou. And especially at the beginning of the period, the inhabitants of Yuegang, Aicheng, and Anai Amping are partly present in Manila. The inhabitants of Fukien are also called Hokkien in the historiography, or Minanese, comment on dit? Minanese. Minanese. Genealogies such as the found in Makassar, like those studies Paola and Claudine Salmon, show the presence of the Minanese in the main ports of Southeast Asia. In Manila and the surrounding area, the number of migrants varied. In the late 16th century, the number of Minanese increased sharply and fluctuated between 10,000 and 30,000. The uprising and the subsequent massacres in 1603, 1639, 1662, 1686, of course, impacted the population without preventing the return of migrants. I won't explain this table, but you can see more or less the number of Sangleyes, Chinese living in Manila. With Lucille Chia, we must distinguish different forms of presence of Chinese in Manila. It is quite simple. These Chinese range from visiting merchants who arrived and left within a few months to sojourners remaining for a few years to those who ended up staying for most of their remaining lifetimes. The first two groups tended to be traders involved directly or indirectly in the junk trade, while the long-term immigrants consisted mainly of those who worked as unskilled laborers, craftsmen, farmers, fishermen, boatmen, and servants. We have to say, to add that many men have children with Tagalog women from the Manila area, which leads to the formation of the Hispanic category Sangleyes Mestizos. Entre dos aguas is the title because the study of this Chinese community includes the question of mobility between Fukien and Manila Bay and requires the consultation of different sources in Spanish and Chinese and probably in Hokkien. From the beginning, we can point out that we are faced with an imbalance, an unequal shares of sources. The vast majority of the sources are Hispanic. They are the result of the imperial paper government of the Spaniards. A good part of them is thus found in the Archivo General de Indias in Sevilla. These archives are very rich, but we need to complete them with other sources. Of the Chinese sources, we have mainly local history of gazetteers, official memorials and decrees, geography, genealogies, and stone inscription. In an article that I read every night, Paola Kalonka said that we can explain the lack of Chinese sources about Philippines with different points. The commercial nature of the Chinese enterprise in the South Asian seas, the ravages of the Wokou influenced the Chinese, I cite Paola, Chinese bureaucratic imaginary and the mistrusts of foreigners. My interest in these sources stems from a project to carry out a social history of this community. Which forms of association or affiliations contribute to make the Sanglayes a community? Starting from the idea that locality is not only a context, but also a context that context generates locality. I will try to understand or to show the places of the Sanglayes and their capacity to produce locality with other groups, the Spanish and the indigenous population in particular. Hence also my interest in environmental issues like agriculture, livestock, fishing, that were part of the Sanglayes activities. The bibliography on the Sanglayes is extensive and is based on a good corpus of documents, as I say, mainly Hispanic. The Lucia Chia's article that I already cited is a great source of inspiration for me. It is based on Hispanic sources of the 1686 uprising, in particular a trial implicating the Sanglayes bakers and other archives. We have to mention the book of Juan Gil, is the most expensive description of the presence of the Sanglayes in the Manila, based on the examination of the contaduria, the counts of the Spanish authorities in Manila. No, this is in Sevilla. So I will explain you 3 or 4 kinds of sources or categories of sources that I will need to study to this project. The first are the most classical, the most known sources, description, reports, maps, and plans. I will be very quick about the Hispanic description from printed sources and official reports and letters that focus most of the time on the Parian. There are well-known description of bishops and religious, and another chronicle of this Antonio de Morga, who was a judge. We have also religious chronicles like the Dominican one, who give lots of information, factual information, and also a lot of material to understand the representation that the Hispanics had of the Chinese and not always the reality of the Chinese. We have also these Chinese sources that Paola already said, and that we we will know much better in a few months but okay. So it's sources often quoted, but I think that a translation and a carefully study a comparison with the Spanish sources could maybe deliver new information, and philology would help too, maybe. Maybe it would be more interesting to study in detail the iconography, like maps that we know, but if we compare those maps, we can maybe see better like urbanism or the construction or the daily life in the Parian. It's a detail, this image is a detail of this well-known bird's eye view of Manila, of the Parian, and I think that we can do a lot of things. We can see boats, and those activities. We have those incredible images of one of the neighborhood of the Chinese. It's called Baiban. It's in front of Manila, in Intramuros, and we can see the organization of the house, the role of the sea here, la mar, se puede leer, because a lot of fishers were living here. The second kind of sources could be the norms and petitions. Norms tend to reify groups into statuses, often distancing them from realities. However, this is not uninteresting in the case of Sanglés to see or to have a look to those norms. We have here an example that could maybe move to a discussion with the Chinese specialists. It is a royal, the judge, the Hispanic judge of Manila, who decreed this order, and it is to the Sanglés, no, for the Sanglés. The traduction is very bad, I'm sorry, as you see. The Christian Sanglés of that jurisdiction of Tondo have among themselves to receive and have a lot of Christian and infidel godchildren to have them in their hands in any occasion that is offered to them, and to use them for false witnesses to which they are inclined with great ease and for little interest, making correspondence and favor and help them in their business. That republic is lost and divided into sides. My question is this a description of a way of social organization of Hokkien in China, like the word we used this morning is Gongsi, the Gongsi? Gongsi. The Gongse, like the clan organization. I don't know how to say it correctly, because maybe we could discuss on but we will do it. Okay. There is a lot of norms that prohibit or regulate the Chinese games or festival in Manila. Thomas Calvoy wrote an article about that. The second idea, it is to study very carefully petitions. We have few petitions, but there is petitions, like maybe less than 10 for the whole 17th century. They have been studied. We have a translation, but I would like to study them together. No, the idea is to take to follow the Simona Ceruti works on supplication in Torino, and try to see what you do when you ask something to the king or to the governor, and you have to present yourself as a group, as a community, and you have to think what the governor wants you to say. And I think that with those kind of paper, you can touch the community, or a community, comment on dit, apparaître, des secrets. Emerge, okay. We have different ones with those signatures. This one is from the Augustinian archives in Valladolid, Spain, and a colleague in Philippines studied this more for the language questions. And we have the last one, that maybe the most known, I don't know. It's a memorial of those Sanglayes of Manila, stating their reason for not being expelled from the Philippine Islands. And well, it's studied by Lucia and others, but I think that we can see the evolution of the community, how they present them, what they defend, etc., etc. Another category of sources could help to understand the different social manifestation of the community. I will go fast. I have 5-10 minutes. Yes. One is very interesting, is the foundation acts of the community fund, in Espanol, Caja de Comunidad. Pues it is a really powerful way to be a community, to have a common money. No? So there is a petition from the Sanglayes, but after we have very few documents. Maybe they are in the Dominican archives documents, but it is a material problem that we will solve, because the archives, they don't have the machine to show the documents, but I will see that. We have the petition, and it is very, in 1609, they had already this. Another one corresponds to Weishung documents is the list of all the houses and shops of the Parian in 1606. And you can see what kind of information there is. The name, the activity, bodegonero, in English, it is someone who sells alcohol. The first shop in the street in alquilada, rent to from Conco. Now Conco is the owner, and Chinsei, he has to rent it. Conco is a Sanglay, is Cristiano, and the price of the rent. And it is said that is only for the months that the boat came from China. La feria, c'est la foire. Okay, not for all the year. And there is a lot of, I think there is this great information, and also other more details that show that there were not all great merchants. Tienda Vacía is a shop with nobody in. Il n'y a personne, empty. Don Sanglay estaba en la puerta, vendiendo. Sanglay was in front of the door selling socks. Medianas, c'est des chaussettes. Voilà, selling socks. Y bla bla bla. Y esto hay como there is 200 or 200 shops, all the shops. Okay, it is after the uprising and massacre, so it explains why there is empty shops. There is a lot of empty shops. So we can, there is other, not much, but other sources, lists of tax list or list of the shops of the Parian. Maybe it is a bit anachronic or no, but maybe we can imagine with other sources, iconographic sources, what would be a shop in the Paria. We have this is very interesting. It is titled "Deed to a Livestock Farm." It means that a Sanglais could have a property, and I think Weishum said that it wasn't possible in Manila, in his summary. There is very few information like this, but I think my idea to make an environmental study, what the Sanglais does in the landscape of Manila Bay, it would be interesting. What they do with that cattle. What cattle did they do it as the Chinese way, the Philippine way? Well, it is an idea. And I will finish saying that studying one event like the uprising of 1603 is a way to have, because there is a lot of sources, description of what they do, where they fuir, where they go away to escape from the Spanish. So you see the links that the Sanglais had in all the whole region of the Manila Bay. It's only a detail. There is a lot, and Birgit knows this very well. In the description of the uprising, the Spanish authorities, they always say that the Anayes are special people. They are richer, and I think, but I'm not the only one, that Anayes correspond to this town. I don't know if it's really a town. Anay. It is at the north of the Weitu Bay, on the bank of the Shijing River, 50 kilometers south of Konzu. Right. Also called Amping, the Flat Bay. And there is the same name in Taiwan. There is a place named Anai. And I think that your colleague François Gipoulou, in his last book, is talking about the Anai, but I think there is a confusion between the Taiwan. He said the Chinese of Manila come from Anai, Taiwan, but it is this Anai in Fujian. Well, it's a detail.
South of Guangzhou,
right?
Then it cannot be in Fujian.
It's
south of Guangzhou, it's in Guangdong. It cannot be in Fujian. Fujian is north of Guangzhou. Guangzhou is
where?
Canton.
C'est Guangzhou for Chenzhou.
Ah oui, l'accent, pardon. C'est aujourd'hui, c'est dans la province du Xinjiang, aujourd'hui. Mais je l'ai retrouvé, ça existe encore aujourd'hui. Exactly. It's what I wanted to say. And finally, we have the famous gazetteer that Itsu Chong used, and that is very interesting. This article. I won't say more. I finished saying that there is other ways to study these Chinese communities, comparing with other Southeast Asian cities with Chinese communities, and using philology, Chinese Hokkien words in Tagalog vocabulary, things like that. That I can do, maybe. That's it. Je ferme.
Yes. Hello, it's me again. Okay, we have about half an hour for some discussion and debate. if there is any, back to see if there is any. Anna, and then Harriet, you have.
Okay. Thank you very much, Birgit and Guillaume, for your excellent presentations. It's always nice to meet again with you and listen your research. I have been thinking on different things that Birgit mentions in her excellent presentation, and I am really interested about the role played by the indigenous, because as I have done in my case with Vittorio Riccio, no, I have been focusing on the Spanish, or in this case, the Italian point of view, because he was an Italian guy, a Dominican one. But I think that probably the indigenous sources, no, tell us a lot of things that maybe we are I don't know how to say in English, sorry for them, I have not the word, olvidando, no, forgetting, no. I don't know if you can explain a little bit more which kind of information have you find on these indigenous, which kind of feelings they have on these episodes, how they live. I think it's very difficult, no, to have this, because the other thing is, as you mentioned, no, the question of the languages, the question of the translation, no, the translations, the documents, it's not a question, but yes, if you can tell a little bit more on this question. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. We answer directly, right? We don't collect. Thank you, Anna. Yeah, well, you said it's a very difficult one, because, of course, we think we should integrate the indigenous perspective, and then what we do is we look for indigenous sources. But then if there are no indigenous written sources, how do you approach it? I mean, what you can do, of course, is to look at the sources we have, but then you need to be aware that they have been filtered through a Spanish understanding. And I mean, the most common example is perhaps that of this Blood Compact and the treaty. And it is then actually by contextualizing an event and reading around the actual event that you get hints. And then what I found very helpful in that case is also to compare what the Dutch described for their encounters in the Moluccas and in parts of Java, where you see very similar practices, and by that you get hints, and then you can fill in some bits and pieces. But that is still very far from, a history of emotions, or a history of practices, or even indigenous understanding or epistemologies of what happened.
Exactly, and also we can. Sorry.
No,
we can also question, no, who were they obeying, no? Because they have their superiors, but also their administrative, or the king, no? They also have their companions in China, in Philippines. So the question of the frontiers, no, and the borders, and where in every time, no, who were obeying them. I don't know how to say, no, because I think that we have to go.
I know what you mean.
As you mentioned, no?
And I think that there it is important that there was this constant negotiations. Just when you think about the Philippines and the small number of Spaniards and their dependence actually on indigenous people, alliances, and then there are also the shifts in alliances and the conflicts among the different indigenous groups. All that needs to be integrated. Thanks.
Okay, Harriet, your hand is up, please.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
It's just like how Birgit just answered Anna. I'm fascinated by the situation in the Philippines. This is also related to what Guillaume said. I mean, they have 3 riots where there's a lot of bloodshed. And yet, it seems to me that this is all a collaborative enterprise. So there are the local indigenous people, there are various degrees of Chinese, and then there are the Spaniards. The Spaniards are outnumbered, but they're better, they have more resources in terms of defending themselves. And how this works, I mean, I don't know of any overseas Chinese community at this time where there's so much complicated relations. I can't say it any other way. Perhaps both of you could answer or reflect on this. It's very new to me. I mean, I've only studied the way the Portuguese behave toward the Chinese, and they're very, very clever. And when the Portuguese hit the Philippines, they're very, very clever. They know how to manipulate everybody, but this is very different. So I would like to be enlightened. Thank you.
For me, it's an aspect of the project. I think that Birgit works on it. But I can't answer with. I think there is a lot of factors to explain. But the idea and why I quoted the Lucille Chia articles, because the idea that we have of the Chinese community in Manila is a community of traders. And if you see you said the list that we have, the most of them were workers. No, they were fishermen, they were laborers, you say craftsmen, and I think there is also maybe I will sound very Marxist, but there is a class problem. No, it's not only an ethnical problem. I think there is like the exploitation of the Chinese. It's my idea to try to make a more social history of those communities to understand what they do every day in the everyday life. It would be at this point my answer.
Thanks. Or maybe I can start with saying, please do write this social history of their everyday lives, because that's what I would be, well, what I'm also very much interested in. To some extent, I also gave up, because I mean, I wrote about it and I worked about it so long, but there is still, as Harriet, you said, I'm also still sometimes amazed when you see that there are so many frictions, there are so many conflicts, it's so complicated there. You would think that the Chinese had ways or places to relocate to, and sometimes they also do. But then when you think of Manila, of course, there is this still quite a lot that makes no sense when you think about 1603, but also the fact that they come back, and a few years later they have reestablished, and I think one is the appeal of the trade and various, maybe not so much the global trade that could be overemphasized, but just the global trade creates other opportunities, and that's where these lower class ordinary workers coming, and the need for, especially since the Spaniards are so few, the need for a workforce. But I think also the indigenous Spanish relations, the more that I work about it, plays into that. One example is just that, so my idea is think that it's a very complicated balance of power with quite some opportunism on all sides, but also lack of alternatives. Because when the 1603 event, I rushed through my slide there, but maybe some of you read it. These Pampangan soldiers, they were actually involved in fighting the Chinese uprising. And one question then, of course, would be if the Pampangans, if they were as militarily powerful, and then they were actually not the Spaniards that had the resources, or not only the Spaniards who had the resources, but also some indigenous groups. And then why are the Spaniards so afraid of the Chinese, but not of the indigenous who live much closer, and who somehow, you know the entire island much better. So that, I think that's part of the bigger picture for this conundrum somehow.
Thanks. Yeah.
Sorry, can I ask something?
Go ahead. Paula, sorry, Paulina.
If you want to go ahead, Ubaldo, it's okay.
Okay, Ubaldo.
Okay, thank you very much. I cannot find the hand. I have problems with this application. So I was just wondering, just connecting to what Birgit just said. This is very interesting because pampangos were used in the campaign in Taiwan. There are studies by Professor Borao on this, and a lot of and this is just before, it's a few years before. And I was wondering about these kind of alliances. According to Southeast Asian practices, you sign a contract, an alliance with a leader, but we talked about this, it depends which leader inside the system, the upriver system, which one of them. And each time the alliance had to be signed again. I mean, that was a pact more than there was no contract among them. That's just a comment for Birgit, and thank you for your presentation. Very useful, very interesting. And for Guillaume, I was interested in this point of Alonso. I saw the name of one Sanglés called Alonso Sauyo. He was the cabeza of the Parian in 1599. I didn't have time to check the quotation, but that's the same period. Is around the end of the 16th century, because that's very interesting point, because Alonso Sauyo sent ships to Japan, and that's precisely the years after the death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi. It's a very delicate moment. I was wondering what was written there. Thank you.
Birgit and Guillaume, please.
Yeah, maybe it was only a comment. I agree. Thank you very much. And just my comment with, there's this study by Stephanie Mawson, some of you probably are aware of it, where she argues that in addition to this idea of kind of pact, there's also the element of coercion or different forms of slavery and using the indigenous labor, so that there's the contract between the Datu or the indigenous elite and the Spaniards, but then the indigenous elites sticks to a pre-Hispanic forms of using unfree labor, and that probably just increases or intensifies with the Spanish need. So I can really recommend that article.
So thanks, Ubaldo. Pues it is, I think it's the idea of the project to cross the knowledge, and I didn't knew the name sounds to me, but I didn't knew that, and it's easy to check it in the Juan Gil book, I suppose, and the sources is very little mentioned in the Protocolo Nuevo de las Obras Pías del Convento de Santo Domingo. Pero te doy la referencia, y la referencia es lo que he puesto en, vamos, the reference is what I put in the PowerPoint. There is no much about him, but it is for me a great information to have cattle and this property. And yes, I think that I can do a bit like what Wei Xing is doing for Taiwan. No, it's to reconstitute the activities and the place, the place of those people. So I will send you the document if you want. Ignacio tiene una pregunta.
Thank you.
I was wondering when you brought us this text about the caja, the caja
De comunidad.
from the Comunidad from the Mariana. I have the impression that Spaniards in Philippines treated the native people as they were the Indians.
Yes.
They belonged to this, this idea of Indians from the Americas, from the Indies, and Caja de Comunidad, this kind of capital of the Chinos del Parián, or these institutions recall very strong the institution from the Pueblos de Indios and the idea of the República de Indios in America, which gave to the communities a kind of protection and legal status. And I am wondering if they are not also trying to have this legal status inside the Manila communities so that they would be protected. And I guess, as in the Pueblos de Indios, you see, to have a church, to have missionaries, to have the caja, the capitan, were very important means to achieve this place, in the middle of the Spanish society. I don't know if there are some words about that, but I guess there is something going on.
Effectivamente. It's a Spanish institution, but the interesting thing is to know if there is the same in China, this kind of community fund, if it exists or not. In America, in Spain, it's very common. So to see the way the Spanish, they institutionalize the people, they use this actually. But in this case, the petition comes from the Sangleyes. So there is, like in Torino, it's not the Spanish that impose that imposed a model. It's a negotiation, and this is a proof of the negotiation, the Caja de Comunidad. That's a point, and the other point is the Chinese are not legally considered to be Indios, which is the indigenous, so they have a special status. They are not Indios, they are not Spanish. There is a special status for the Sangleyes. And the Spanish at the beginning, they used the model of Alcaicería of Grenada. The way they treat the Muslims in Grenada, in Spain. So they use this kind of legal status. So it's a mix of way to organize and to control the people. But I think it's not always from the top to the people, but those Sangleyes, they are part of this process to become Sangley, because there is a protection. There is they have taxes, they have a lot of agravios, but there is also protections. So it will be my answer.
Okay, Paulina.
I have a question for Birgit and Guillaume. Birgit, I also like your presentation because you're trying to do a multilingual and multi-factor research in the history of diplomacy of the Philippines. And in that sense, I'd like to know if you're taking into account the southern part of the Philippines, because I know that the sultans are negotiating with other actors rather than the Spanish. And I was thinking of something when you're talking about indigenous diplomacy, I was thinking more of the native communities, because there is this work by Laura Lee Jonker in which she explains how in the pre-Hispanic Philippines, there were these raids or piracy activity, pirates by the Spanish sources, in which there was a group coming into a community and captured women from that community, took the women with them. The women had children, and then they returned to make peace treaties because of those women that belong to that community. So I know that after the Spanish arrived, these raids or pirate activities continued. And it would be interesting to know if those peace agreements between communities outside the Spanish administration continue. It would be interesting to know that just to see from the point of view of the native communities and not always the Spanish the sources. I don't know if that would be possible to know. And the second question is for Guillaume. Besides the unskilled Chinese people that normally arrive in the Philippines, there were other profiles or professionals. You know that after the Manila earthquake of 1645, the Spanish authorities had hired Chinese carpenters and blacksmiths in order to reconstruct or the reconstruction of the city. And one of them was called the maestro, Chinese, the maestro, etc. So I am pretty sure that there were other artisans, craftsmen like this profile. And those are my questions.
Okay, Birgit.
Yes, thank you, Paulina. Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for reminding me of Laura Lee Jonker's work. That's really crucial, and I think that these pre-Hispanic patterns continued outside the influence of the Spaniards. But of course, for the southern Philippines or for the southern part, it's very difficult again. I mean, there's the same issue here, that we only know that what happens when when the Spaniards try to defend the local population or when they report about raiding. But quite clearly at the fringes of Mindanao and also the Visayas, I think these patterns continue. And I think what I'm also planning to do, and I keep saying that and haven't really come to it yet, is to integrate it with other maritime relations. There's also this fascinating work by Jennifer Gaynor, which is not so much on raiding, but it's on other maritime alliances and agreements with intermediaries such as the Bugis. And I think these are both examples of indigenous patterns that continue to exist far into the 19th century. And they then, in the case of the Spanish Philippines, should of course be combined, but also read against the occasional actual interaction of the Spaniards with Jolo, with Jolo, and also with the Malucos. But thank you.
Thank you for my birthday. Now, yes, there is example, well-known example. There is the one with fundidor, blacksmith, so? Herrero. He made cannons, and also he made the statue of the Virgin of the Dominicans, the both, and he was very. There is a document about this guy at the beginning of the 16th century, 17th century, and there is the printers, the printers. So there is a lot of example, but in the 20,000 Sanglais. There is a lot where I think simple people, no? The fishermen. There is a source that said there were 5,000 fishermen, Chinese fishermen. It is enormous, no? So I think they were. Comment on dit, abastecer. They were supplying the whole city, no? They were supplying food for the city. Hortelanos, people who were doing vegetable, agricultural, yeah, they were the most representative. And then like those special skilled carpenters in the bakers, butchers, those are yes. So it is a whole world that I would like to. And I have a question for the Chinese specialist. There is this community fund, but there is the question of the petitions. You can, if you are a Chinese, you can petition the emperor or the governor, or no? There is this kind of things. If you are a Chinese, can you petition the governor or the emperor? No, there is
Directly, no, but you can go to the governor.
There is no paper like I'm
not as an ordinary individual.
Okay, yeah, as a community.
You can petition the local magistrate.
Okay,
but you have to go through someone that will write the text for you and etc. from people and that's it. But yeah, you cannot petition higher levels unless you are yourself inside the bureaucracy.
But you have met, for example, you know, when they go to emperor, but you can see emperor and vanish the Southeast Asia trade in 1717. I mean, there's a lot of merchants in Toulouse and they work with local authorities because there's there is a lot of go and back to the aging network government and but in the province actually in China, but through the canal of or native from this province, but work in the government in Beijing.
For me, it would be interesting to know what the Sanglais do in Manila. They could have done it in China.
Yeah, but they do it in Batavia, for example.
If there is a cultural something like they had before, but we will discuss that.
No, but as a group or as an individual, you can always refer yourself to the authorities. That's possible, but you cannot go all the way up unless you move from where you are with a petition and you go to the capital. There is also this possibility, but no one would do that from Fujian. Well, not many people would do that for that kind of thing. If you have a big, if there's a big problem like a big injustice, that's where you would do that. But you would do that because you received that the injustice was done by lower level officials. Like the magistrate, the local magistrate would not, like, I don't know, your husband was killed and this was not taken care of by the or your wife, whatever. And then you would go to the magistrate, he would not do anything, and so you would go. You could go to the higher levels, but you would have to move the petition by yourself.
Okay.
In groups, as Paula says, groups like merchants and etc. had some influence. Of course, they would have ways to get their message go to the authority. These would then refer to at their higher levels. Okay. No, there would be possibilities.
Yeah, but it's in favor.
Thank you.
Yeah, there are no more questions. That's okay. So let's close the session. We are more or less. So, thank you for attending this meeting. Birgit and Rachel, Ubaldo, Harriet, Anna, João Paulo, well, and myself that I'm there. So see you, hope to see you all tomorrow at the same time at 10 o'clock, Lisbon hour. See you. Bye. Thank you.
Bye, thank you. Good to see you all.
Thank you. See you.